Ladies and gentlemen, we're happy to be here at the Denver Law School today to help explain several aspects of Colorado legal history. We appreciate the invitation from Professor Justice Gregory Hobbs, who we have long admired for his generosity and wisdom. Your presenters today are attorney Ruth Wright and engineer Kenneth Wright.
I'm Ruth Wright. Besides being a lawyer, I was a Colorado legislator for 14 years, including 6 as minority leader. I also was a member of several of the organizations featured in this lecture and have been involved in the environmental movement in Colorado for a long time.
As a consulting engineer in Colorado for 60 years, I have watched some of the state's legal history develop. As a hydrologist studying the use and handling of water by ancient people, I learned that ancient residents of Colorado were adept at community organization. This meant that water supplies could be built and successfully maintained for hundreds of years. Our subject today is health and the environment, which begins in Colorado with the early Americans of more than 1,000 years ago. The story begins with water, land, and community in southwestern Colorado. People first settled in southwestern Colorado because of maize. Long before that, ancient Mexicans experimented with teosinte and developed maize. Finally, after several thousand years, maize found its way to the Four Corners area. Maize allowed the early Americans to settle down and give up their hunter-gatherer life. They built homes in Mesa, Verde, and established communities. The first period is the basket makers from 550 to 700 AD. The Pueblo I people period ranged from 700 to 900 AD. Then there's the Pueblo II people ranging from 900 to 1100 AD. And finally, the Pueblo III people from 1100 to 1300 AD. We know lots about these early Americans and their way of life and civil order because of the plentiful evidence they left behind for us to study, such as these Mesa Verde sherds. Our work at Mesa Verde started in 1995. Our first excavation in Mesa Verde National Park was at a mysterious mound in Moorfield Canyon. Evidence told us that the mound was a reservoir dating to 750 AD and that it was in operation for 350 years. A second project was Box Elder Reservoir, which dates from 800 AD to 950 AD. This reservoir was discovered only 20 years ago after a forest fire. Another reservoir is Farview Reservoir, which is also known as Mummy Lake. It was in operation from 950 to 1180 AD. Here is a trench wall of Sagebrush Reservoir in Mesa Verde dating from 950 to 1100 AD. After our field work was completed, we plotted the 4 reservoirs on a map and found that all 4 reservoirs were built on a straight east-west line. This helps prove that the ancient people had solar observatory capabilities. Tree ring studies took us back to 500 AD. The huge drought from 1135 to 1180 changed the patterns of land, water, and community in southwest Colorado. Community was important to the Pueblo II people. The Pueblo III people moved to cliff dwellings for safety from roving hostile bands during the 12th century. Water supply development took a new turn at Mughouse when storm runoff from Cap Rock was captured for domestic water supplies. The runoff was caught in a cistern at Mughouse that held up to 9,000 gallons. As a symbol of the changed regime, this 13th century cliff dwelling, known as Two-Story House, was photographed by William Henry Jackson in 1874, who was with the Hayden expedition.
We now take a great leap forward in time to the 1950s. I will not talk about climate change, the most existential environmental problem that we face now, but I will focus on the most important resources of this great planet, land and water. As we say, think globally and act locally. So I start with a small college town of Boulder, Colorado, 60,000 population in the 1950s. Here you have Boulder on the right, then the swath of green which we call the mountain backdrop. Further to the left we have our iconic Flatirons, and in the background the Rocky Mountains covered with snow. The next picture shows Boulder a little earlier, showing that the University of Colorado is in the foreground, and the background again is our Flatirons and the other mountains. It was post-war, and Americans were on the move. GIs had seen places in America that were much more exciting than back east. With a booming economy and mountains beckoning, Colorado became a destination, and Boulder was a part of that pilgrimage. It began in 1959 when the city fathers decided to supply water to the hillside just west of the city, the one that's called the mountain backdrop, so that it could be developed. The citizens were stunned. Professors came up with a novel idea to pick an elevation on the mountain backdrop above which the city was forbidden to supply water and put that restriction into the city charter. It could only be changed by a vote of the citizens, and it controlled all aspects of city government. It passed easily and is now called the Blue Line. So there's the Blue Line in that picture, and with the city nestled against it, not going any further to the west. Realizing that such issues might arise again at any time, they formed a citizens action group called Plan Boulder. Sure enough, just a few years later, a huge commercial development was proposed on top of the enchanted Mesa, a very beautiful and visible site just below the mountain backdrop. Plan Boulder had started endorsing candidates for city council, and by this time, the new council shared our values and placed a $100,000 bond issue on the ballot to buy the Mesa, and once again got an overwhelming yes. But these were stopgap measures. We were growing at the rate of 7% a year, which would double our population in 10 years. It was time to be bold. After we organized a Greenbelts for Boulder conference, the mayor and our city manager proposed a politically astute measure, a 1-cent sales tax to be divided between greenbelts and major thoroughfares. So the Chamber of Commerce types were on board. We launched a spirited campaign, won by 62%, and Boulder became the first city in America to tax itself to purchase land for the sole purpose of keeping it free from development. Why Boulder? It could have been the type of people who lived here: professors, scientists, researchers, and climbers. But I think it was Mother Nature herself who inspired us, and we wanted to protect her and her critters. Here are some of the pictures of why we wanted to save our lands. The Flatirons, the ponds, the hiking, and the beautiful flowers, the critters, etc., etc. I end this with a slide which has become iconic and is still used today, our backdrop of the Flatirons. The front skier is Gary Lacey, my son-in-law, and on his back he has 1-year-old Mason. The reason I show this is because this picture is still used today, and I know Mason is now 30 years old, and so it's 29 years ago, and the same picture could be taken today. Boulder County soon followed. Subdivision regulations required a small donation of land or money for schools or other public purposes. So many acres of open space were obtained without using tax dollars, and the citizens of the county also passed a tax to purchase large tracts. Both the city and county bought farmlands in Boulder Valley to prevent urban sprawl while keeping our local agriculture. Neighboring Jefferson County followed. 4 dedicated League of Women voters started Plan Jeffco. It has a robust program buying land and also providing recreational facilities. Here I want to show you some growth charts. Starting in 1940, obviously the big blob on the right is Metro Denver, and then heading to the left is Boulder, and to the right is Longmont. So this is 1940. The next one was taken in 1960. So between 40 and 60, this was the influence of the GIs. But it continued to 1980, getting bigger. And 2000, really huge. Now you note that there's white between the metropolitan area and Boulder on the left. And that was because those areas are protected areas. So it was successful in urban planning and keeping subdivisions from the valley. There's a growth population chart which continues from 2020 and goes all the way up to about 2050. And you can see the projection line just keeps adding more people, more population, including Boulder County. When I say purchase the land, most people think of owning the land in fee. That is, the total ownership of the land. But most open space land is protected by a conservation easement. A conservation easement is a voluntary legal agreement that permanently limits uses of the land in order to protect its conservation values. A conservation easement is one option to protect a property from future generations. The land continues to be owned by the private party, say a farmer or rancher. But the owner has signed a very specific legal agreement, a contract, with a land trust or local government, which keeps the land in agricultural use, but imposes certain restrictions appropriate for that particular farm. For example, how many buildings are permitted, limits on where the road can be built, essentially prohibiting development which would impair its conservation values. In most cases, these restrictions reduce the value of the property. The owner gets both a state and federal income tax credit as a charitable contribution based on the difference between the value before and after the restrictions are imposed. However, since some landowners may not have enough income to be able to fully use the tax credit, laws permit the owners to sell the tax credit to a taxpayer who can fully deduct it. Why would any landowner voluntarily accept such a permanent restriction to their property? Certainly not for any financial benefits. Fortunately, there are some families that want the land they love to be protected in perpetuity, a place where they've raised their children in a special, hardworking but rewarding lifestyle. And some of these now grown-ups may want to continue living in that lifestyle. Now back to the story. Boulder and Jefferson County, that's only 2 counties out of 64. So who took it to the top? Who took it to all of Colorado? It was Governor Roy Romer and his executive director of the Department of Natural Resources, Ken Salazar. As a result of their efforts, the citizens placed an initiative on the 1992 ballot, a constitutional amendment to create the Great Outdoors Colorado Trust Fund, with a board of citizens appointed by the governor. It is now Article 27 of the Colorado Constitution. It redirected lottery proceeds from construction projects to protecting wildlife, parks, to rivers, trails, and open space, eventually producing $50 million annually for those purposes. It won handily statewide by 58%. However, at that same election, another constitutional measure was adopted, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, called TABOR, an amendment to Article 10. Unfortunately, it had a crippling language which drastically reduced the use of new revenues coming from current taxes, so that even in great economic times, the ratcheting down effect created a situation which governments, entities could never recover, and it is still in effect. When these constitutional amendments passed, the Colorado legislature had to pass implementing legislation. Whether intentional or inadvertent, the proposed legislation placed GOCO under TABOR. That is, GOCO would possibly have to comply with the complexities and tight restrictions built into Tabor. The Republican leadership had never been supportive of GOCO, which is why the citizens had to put it on the ballot. And while the legislation might have caused sticky problems for GOCO, the Republicans' leadership somehow did not realize that it would cause a $50 million problem to our own legislative budget for Colorado. When that was pointed out, several legislators switched, but it was still defeated by only one vote. GOCO does not purchase land or build recreational facilities. To accomplish its missions, it makes grants in 4 quadrants, each getting 1/4 of the proceeds. I was fortunate to be on that first board, all appointed by Governor Romo, with Ken Salazar as our chair. We enthusiastically plunged ahead and hired 2 extraordinary people after a nationwide search, Will Shafroth and Lisa Angebrook. They created a thoughtful and dynamic agenda for us. So first, we started out by visiting local communities throughout the state to get the wish lists from the local citizens, and also invited the local legislators to those meetings. That turned out to be a valuable exercise. A few years later, when the powerful majority leader sponsored a bill to move GOCO funds to education, which was actually a shell game, the legislators, including members of her own party, killed her bill in committee because they knew that their constituents loved the program. In addition, early on, Will and Lisa realized that many farmers and ranchers liked the easement idea, but were very wary of local governments or land trusts becoming the owners and managers of such easements. So Will and Lisa had a brilliant idea. Leaders in the cattle industry were intrigued, especially when we said we would pay for a professional director for 3 years to get it going. Since then, the Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust has become one of the most successful land trusts in Colorado, partnering with more than 270 ranching families and conserving more than 570,000 acres. To sum it up, the GOCO board and staff accomplishes their mission by granting lottery funds to state parks and wildlife, local governments, and land trusts to do the job. To date, GOCO has committed more than $1.2 billion in lottery proceeds to more than 5,200 projects in all 64 counties without any tax dollar support, and is still going strong. With all this revenue becoming available, citizens around the state were inspired to create local land trusts to preserve and protect their favorite places. So over the years, 22 land trusts were created in Colorado. 2 were statewide and the others were local. In addition, there are 2 national land trusts, the Nature Conservancy and the Trust for Public Lands, that are working in Colorado. For nearly 50 years, the Nature Conservancy in Colorado has protected nearly 1 million acres and improved 1,000 river miles across the state. The Nature Conservancy is a national and international behemoth. In Colorado alone, it has protected 1 million acres of land and improved 1,000 river miles across the state. The Trust for Public Lands, a national organization, has protected lands all over Colorado, as depicted on this map, which brings us to Colorado Open Lands. Its mission is to preserve the significant open lands and natural heritage of Colorado through private and public partnerships, innovative land conservation techniques, and strategic leadership. I joined the board about 10 years ago. It has become one of my most rewarding experiences. It has given me great insight into how successful land trusts work. Leadership on the board and the professional president are absolutely essential as an excellent support staff. We have them in spades. To work throughout the Colorado to find the special properties, like on the screen above, and encourage landowners to place their land in conservation easements to coal. It also works in reverse. We have a great reputation, so landowners come to us from the beginning, such as Conservation Committee, which is the first to review and judge the individual projects. There is the all-important Finance Committee, which analyzes the annual budget, and so on. Which brings me to the essential topic of stewardship. Stewardship is legally required by all accredited land trusts. It means that once a year, our staff visits each property to make sure that the owner of the property has complied with all of the requirements of the easement contract, a huge undertaking. Which brings up another essential component, money. Where do our funds come from? Obviously, GOCO grants are a basic source. Then there are the foundations, like Walton, Gates, and the Grant family, which have been very generous to coal. The federal Farm Bill provides funding for conservation easements and has recently increased its funding nationwide by $2 billion. Some of the landowners even give stewardship funds as an additional compensation. And then there are the private donors of funds, individuals, corporations, and other entities that support our work. I love this little cartoon which says, "The key to successful fundraising, as with many other things, is having the right attitude." There is so much more to tell, but I will mention just a few. Protection of the acequias in the San Luis Valley is a huge endeavor as we try to keep the water rights, their acequias, in the historic and culturally rich valley. The Grains for Cranes program works with farmers to leave patches of grains unharvested along the flyway, training interns who can then bring their expertise to other land trusts, involving families and children so they become the environmentalists of tomorrow. You can see why I love it. Incidentally, Colorado Open Lands has produced a very useful document entitled Sharing Water to Save the Farm, a guide to agricultural municipal water sharing for Colorado's land conservation community. Just as Hobbs has copies, and they are also available from Colorado Open Lands. Before I go any further, I have to tell you the unhappy story about easements. A willing seller and a willing buyer, what could go wrong? A lot. The system depends on honest appraisers, and the problem started to surface in the mid-2000s. Unscrupulous appraisers had used very inflated values for farmlands in eastern Colorado, as though they were potential subdivisions near Denver. When they were eventually rejected, the landowners had already received their credits, and some were sold to secondary buyers for their tax reduction. It eventually hit the fan when the state started asking for the back taxes owed because the land wasn't worth what the landowners had claimed. The Denver Post was not very sympathetic at that time, saying that landowners almost certainly had a good idea what their property was worth, but were quite willing to accept outsized appraisals at taxpayers' expense. This was then, and this is now. Nothing has been resolved, and pitiful stories have been published about bankruptcy and foreclosures of family farms. So last year, the legislature formed a working group to pay back the landowners millions of dollars they were forced to pay the state, possibly costing more than $270 million. Please tune in for the next chapter. Now we go on to the fundamental issues of water. In Colorado, water is liquid gold, used primarily for municipalities including lawns, industry, and agriculture. In Colorado, this means owning water rights, or actually owning the rights to use the water beneficially. Colorado is a first-in-time, first-in-right appropriation doctrine state, where water rights are real property and have a date of appropriation. The earlier, the more valuable the right. These water rights can be bought and sold, used on different land or for a different purpose, like municipal or industrial, and may some require diversions from the river. However, the quantity of the right to be changed is based on historical beneficial use, and everything must be approved by a state water court. Colorado Open Lands buys the water associated with the land, especially if it is irrigated land. All of our easements include the water necessary to protect the conservation values. Environmentally speaking, of course, we citizens also want water flowing in our creeks and rivers and kept in our wetlands. However, the concept of keeping water in the stream is fairly new and thought to have a major legal obstacle, the requirement that water must be diverted from a stream in order to recognize the right. As you can see, the sad, dewatered Crystal River near Carbondale. However, the concept of keeping water in the streams is fairly new and thought to have a major legal obstacle: the requirement that the water must be diverted from a stream in order to be recognized as a water right. That was an open question until 1973, when the Colorado legislature adopted Senate Bill 97, the in-stream flow statute, which authorized the Colorado Water Conservation Board to obtain decrees for in-stream flow rights. However, there was still the question whether this legislation was constitutional under the Constitution. Since Justice Hobbs has recently authorized a comprehensive article entitled Distributed Water Justice, Colorado's Doctrine of Prior Appropriation incorporates in-stream flows rights on behalf of the people. I will only discuss my involvement in this issue. I was a newly minted attorney when the Boulder League of Women Voters, of which I am a member, asked me to write an amicus, friend of the court brief, on their behalf, pro bono, of course. Since the Colorado legislature had already given its blessing, the only issue left was whether or not a diversion is mandated by the Colorado Constitution. A test case was required. A West Slope in-stream water right was chosen, thinking that a West Slope water judge would decide in favor of constitutionality. I researched the issue and wrote a short brief. To my dismay, the chosen judge recused himself because his wife belonged to the League of Women Voters. I immediately attempted to withdraw my brief, but to no avail. But this was only a temporary blip. A different judge was chosen who did decide the in-stream flow right to be constitutional. The case was appealed directly to the Colorado Supreme Court. So I wrote an extensive brief, but at 12 pages, it was undoubtedly the shortest one by far. I addressed the usual court cases, but then wondered how an in-stream flow right would be administered. Fortunately, my husband is a water engineer with a specialty in water rights. He explained how it would be much easier to administer an in-stream flow right than an ordinary water right, which I detailed in the brief. Months went by. Unexpectedly one evening, I got a call from the clerk of Chief Justice Erickson saying that I had won the case. It was the night before the decision would be published. Of course, I knew I was just one of the many attorneys he was calling, but he made a specific remark. The justices were wondering how the in-stream flow right would be administered, and you gave them the answer. Then a few days later, Justice Groves, who wrote the decision, called me and said, "I want to meet the new water lawyer in town." He was a totally delightful and down-to-earth lunch companion, and I will never forget the joy of that experience. The court decision put the Colorado Water Conservation Board front and center into the in-stream flow business. The court decision put the Colorado Water Conservation Board front and center into the in-stream flow business. The CWCB was created over 80 years ago. Today it works on a broad range of programs and is responsible for protecting our streams and lakes, flood mitigation, watershed protection, drought planning, water supply planning, and project financing. The criteria for the amount of water required to meet the goal in any particular waterway was, quote, to protect the environment to a reasonable degree. The new responsibility was compatible with the other duties and responsibilities of the CWCB already had, with the technical staff to implement it. There's now another entity which should be mentioned, the Colorado Water Trust. Its mission is to restore flows to Colorado rivers in need. Since its founding in 2001, CWC has returned over 9 billion gallons of water to nearly 400 miles of river and streams. It works very closely with the Colorado Water Conservation Board through the in-stream flow program. It is a small nonprofit that works with people using win-win solutions to keep rivers flowing and communities healthy. In summary, since the early 1950s, there are hundreds of thousands of acres of land in Colorado that are protected in perpetuity and many miles of streams that have been restored. It's the work of innumerable dedicated and caring people, both in and out of government. And while we are concerned about rampant growth, too many subdivisions, too many cars, let's appreciate what we have accomplished and pledge to continue protecting our precious land and water.
Land, water, and community goals are also tied to flood control and drainage, for which Attorney Joe Shoemaker was a local hero. I met Joe Shoemaker in 1962 when he served under Denver Mayor Richard Batterton. Shoemaker was Mayor Pro Tem and Director of Public Works for Batterton. Shoemaker said that drainage solutions were elusive. Drainage and flood control were the only city problems that he could not get his arms around. Denver flooding problems came to a head in 1965 when the South Platte River went on a rampage through Denver. Unfortunately, then Denver Mayor Tom Corrigan also had other problems. One was southeast Denver at South Broadway and Evans Avenue. Mayor Corrigan and his public works staff, headed by Bill McNichols, hired me to solve the South Broadway flooding using $2.3 million in sales tax money. I started work 3 miles east of the South Broadway problem at Colorado Boulevard. The Harvard Gulch project started at that point. The project was finished in 1967, 3 weeks before Mayor Corrigan was up for re-election for another 4-year term. Joe Shoemaker lived in the project neighborhood and noted our construction project on his way home from the state capitol, where he was a leading Republican senator and chairman of the legislator's Joint Budget Committee. He saw that urban drainage was more than just storm sewers and street pavement. Shoemaker hired me to come up with a metro area planning and design criteria using the 5-county engineers committee as a contracting vehicle. Upon signing the contract with Shoemaker in 1967, I called in Dr. Gilbert White of the University of Chicago for help. White was a national leader in flood management. White sent me one of his trusted PhD students, Dr. Jack Schaefer, to visit me in Denver to discuss Denver's flooding problems. I hired Dr. Schaefer right then. I then brought in D. Earl Jones, who served in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as chief engineer and architect. Jones, Schaefer, Shoemaker, and I formulated the new manual that was quickly adopted by the 5 Denver metro counties and the several dozen cities and towns that were affected. The manual provided the planning and engineering details for use in the 5-county area. The 1969 manual included a chapter on drainage and flood control law that was written by Senator Shoemaker. The updated chapter is still in use today. The goal for the manual was to solve the metro area drainage and flood control chaos that was brought to light by the 1965 flood. At the same time as the manual, Shoemaker prepared the Urban Drainage and Flood Control Act and had it passed by the state legislature in the summer of 1969. It still serves as the metro area district that is now known as the Mile High Flood District. As a result of Senator Shoemaker's vision and hard work as a lawyer and legislator, the Denver metro area now looks to storm drainage water as a resource, and the previous urban chaos is now overcome. Water-based recreation in Denver has skyrocketed. Denver's Mayor McNichols' flood control legacy has been established. Ladies and gentlemen, this finishes our lecture on Colorado legal history from the standpoint of health and environment. We appreciate your attention and look forward to seeing you again next year.